let's establish our history. 7th century, Muslims began invading countries and taking over all the way really into France until
50% of all the Christians in the world at the time of the 7th century were wiped out in the next 3 centuries. In the first,
by whom?
By the Muslim jihadists.
All right.
In the first 3 centuries of Islam, we're talking about from 632 AD, the death of Muhammad, all the way through, for the first 3 centuries of Islam, they wiped out 50% of all the Christians on the planet. Now, you may not think this is too impressive yet, but let me point out that the church's heartland at that time was the Middle East and North Africa. Europe was the backwater, and of course America hadn't been discovered yet. Now, the Muslims wiped out 3,200 churches. We're talking about 3,200 church buildings wiped out in North Africa in the first 3 centuries alone. Remember, all the greatest names of early church history were North Africans. Origen, Augustine, Tertullian,
all right,
Ignatius,
only because we got to do this in lickety-split time. So up until about the 11th century, finally about 1092, 1093, Pope Urban II.
5 centuries of Islamic jihad. They've just about almost took France if it wasn't for the Battle of Tours, and they on there destroying the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Empire. They've destroyed 10,000 church buildings just in the century before the Crusades begin. Now, Bill Clinton says in his speeches, the tensions and the violence in the Middle East began with the Crusades. I can't believe the man's that ignorant. They start 5 centuries before the Crusades began.
Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Crusades. Mostly the motivations, and I say motivations in the plural because like all wars, there's the primary motivation of the actual boots on the ground, the guys who actually fight and die, and the primary motivation of their leaders who take them there. And those motivations are rarely the same. And you'll see that in all wars, really, throughout all of history. That being said, though, the Crusades are altogether worthy of Western pride, with heroic feats of endurance and bravery. And I hope to give you a glimpse of those which might, spur you on to educate yourself about the subject. You'll find no end of sources on YouTube. Just go over there and learn as much as you can because, you deserve to be proud of what your ancestors have done. This is an altogether fascinating episode in history, and I hope to maybe spur your interest a little bit. Unfortunately, there really aren't a lot of movies that you can watch about this subject, movies that are any good anyway. There's Kingdom of Heaven, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Orlando Bloom. It's pretty good. It has a lot of historical gaps in it that really aren't correct, but overall it gives you a pretty good flavor for what was going on, the motivations of all the people from the very bottom to the very top of European society. But you can't really understand the Crusades, though, unless you understand the importance of the spice trade. Because European nobles ate meat. That was what they ate. Vegetables were more or less considered to be peasant food. The nobles ate meat, and there were a lot of reasons for that, mostly because people who eat meat are smart. People who eat meat are a whole lot smarter than people who just eat a bunch of vegetables. And the nobles, they knew that, and so they guarded very zealously their monopoly on eating meat. The only trouble with that is that they didn't have refrigeration, and the meat got gamey. It got kind of rotten sometimes. And they discovered that with spices, you could cover up the nasty taste of the rotten meat they were eating. So the spice trade was all the rage across Europe. And the Italian city-states, along with the papal states, because the Pope, he ruled the country back then in central Italy. They all had fleets of ships, and they did commerce all over the Mediterranean. And they thought that if they could gain a foothold in Asia, they could corner a market on the importation of spices into Europe and make a shitload of money. So they got the Pope, who was an Italian, Pope Urban II, and he, at the behest of the Italian city-states, used his religious authority to call for a crusade to take back the Holy Land, to take Jerusalem, because those pesky old Muslims were preventing pilgrims from being able to go to Jerusalem, and it was just so awful. So they all had to get together, and they had to go take the Holy Land and take Jerusalem for the Lord. And of course, they did. His call for crusade was answered all across Europe. So see, you have it right there. You have the leaders who are wanting to make a shitload of money, and then you have the ordinary guys down on the ground, the fighters, and they're wanting to go fight for the Lord and fight for Christianity. So, but anyway, those interests coincided, and off to the Holy Land they went. There was a lot of opportunity for nobility. The younger sons of nobility who couldn't inherit any land in Europe, they saw the Crusades as an opportunity to gain land status and wealth. You know, they couldn't be a lord or a duke or what have you, because their oldest brother got that. So if they went to the Holy Land and set up a kingdom there, they could maybe get their own fiefdoms of their own and gain titles of their own. So that was a big motivation for the second sons. And then you had chivalric idealism and religious zeal. You know, the concept of chivalry, which included bravery, honor, and loyalty, was intertwined with the Crusades. And the call to arms was often framed as a pilgrimage of sorts, where fighting for the Holy Land could lead to the remission of sins. That's another thing the Pope said. If you go fight in crusade and you die, your sins will all be forgiven automatically. Kind of like the jihadis today think they're all going to go to heaven and get their 72 virgins in that big whorehouse in the sky they conceive as heaven. So anyway, that was a big motivation as well. And then there was defense against Muslim expansion. While the initial Crusades were offensive, there was also a defensive aspect. Muslim forces had conquered much of what was once Christian Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire. Most people don't realize it, but the Roman Empire didn't pass out of existence until 1453. Only, a couple of decades before Columbus discovered America. There was genuine fear of further Muslim expansion in Europe. It was very genuine and very justified. Here's a map of the trade routes from east to west, and as you can see, they passed through the Arabian Sea. And one route went up through the Red Sea and across land through Egypt to get to the Mediterranean. And then there's the other one that went through the Persian Gulf and across land. And it went right to the Levant there, the Holy Land. So as you can see, if you could control that area, you could make a lot of money. And, the trade wasn't just spices, although that was the main reason. The main trade. There were silk, fabrics, and perfume. These guys, you got to understand, these guys were some stinky people in Europe. One of my degrees is in history. I know a little bit about the subject. These guys, it was said that a man would take a bath when he was born, and then they'd bathe his body after he'd died, and that was it. They were some really stinky people. To give you an idea, they would only change a baby's diapers like every few months. And that's the truth. Look it up. They were nasty, and the perfume covered up the nasty smell. They did, take like sponge baths, and wipe themselves off with the wet rag, but still, they didn't bathe. They were nasty. Yeah, and they didn't wipe their butts either. Literally, they didn't wipe their asses. It must have been awful. And people all over the world always commented about the rancid smell of Europeans. So I think you can see where I'm going with this. This area right in there was It was a bottleneck of booty. Wonderful wealth and booty. And you know, it's still today. There's a proposed trade route that's supposed to go across the Arabian Peninsula and come out there in the Middle East, in Israel, in Gaza. But you know, they can't really open up that trade corridor as long as Gaza's there, you know, to toss hand grenades and cut people's heads off along the way. So even to this day, thousands of years later, it's the same thing. Now let's take a very simple and brief look at the history leading up to the Crusades. See, most people don't really think about it, but the Muslims had been invading Christendom for 700 years. Look at those colored areas on that map. Most of those were Christian lands, all through North Africa, the Middle East there, and Spain. They conquered all of Spain, and Spain was Muslim for 600 years. They were finally stopped in France when they tried to invade France. The Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. The prospect of being invaded by the Muslims was a very real fear. And, you know, they invaded Italy, they invaded Sicily, Syracuse, Cyprus, you know, just about any place. They were trying to take it over in the name of Allah. Well, in the name of Allah and the name of filthy lucre, too. But anyway. And all during this time, see, they were raiding the coast of Europe. And they were kidnapping people and making slaves out of them. It's been estimated well in excess of 1 million people were kidnapped off the shores of Europe and made to work as slaves, worked to death. The men were worked to death, and the good-looking women were made into sex slaves. And that's just the way it went for 700 years. You know, the last time they tried it was in the late 1600s. So when the Pilgrims were settling here in North America, the Muslims were invading Europe, trying to turn St. Peter's into a mosque. They swore they'd turn St. Peter's into a mosque, and they were stopped at the gates of Vienna in Austria. But still, this was an ongoing threat. And just about this time, Europe started to get back up on its feet. And, you know, after all that time and all that bullshit, these guys were ready for some payback. And that was really, if you want to get right down to the nut cutting about why this happened, you had a lot of pissed off white people who were ready for some payback. And that really what it all boils down to, for the people anyway. I mean, of course, if you can make some money while you're doing it, that's good too, which is what they were doing. But mostly, we're looking at a 700-year blood feud between these peoples. So here we are, the First Crusade. Now, they went through the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire here, and you can see the route here. They went along through here, and then they had some battles along through there, and then they came down. But they couldn't get to Jerusalem without taking Antioch. It was paramount. They had to take Antioch, or they couldn't go any further. So there was a huge siege. Oh, my goodness. The deprivation and bloodshed was unbelievable, and we're going to go over that in a minute. See, you got to understand about these Europeans. They valued military prowess above all things. The boys, the noble boys, they were taught to fight like from the earliest years. Taught to ride, taught to fight. That's all they did all day long, was train to fight. Being a fighter and a warrior was absolutely the pinnacle of what a man could be. And they were, you can't imagine what murder machines these European knights were. You just cannot imagine. But I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. I mean, the Japanese samurai wouldn't have stood a prayer against these guys. They were just fierce. And like I said, they were ready for some payback. So anyway, here we are at Antioch, and after a series of unsuccessful assaults on the walls, they were kind of between a rock and a hard place until they finally got this Armenian guy on the inside to open up the city gate. So in they rushed, and they put the whole city to the sword. They took the city, but not the inner citadel, the keep, and the Muslims still retained control of that. So here they are in the city with the Muslims in the keep, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes a Muslim relief army. So they find themselves trapped inside the city with the big Muslim army on the outside and the Muslims in the keep on the inside. So they're stuck and starving. They started to starve, man. They were killing the horses. They were killing rats. They would take the skins of animals and boil them to try to make like a broth out of them. And, you know, they were actually going through piles of shit, trying to pick out any undigested pieces that was in the shit. And they were eating that too. And I've never heard any accounts of cannibalism. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if they weren't doing that with the dead. I wouldn't be a bit surprised at that at all. Starving men will do the most desperate things to stay alive. So here they are. And then this guy named Peter, he's a monk. He declares that he knows, you know, some holy relic is buried. And so he goes, let's go dig over here. And, you know, the Christian leaders, they say, oh, okay. And so they go and they dig. And they dig a big hole and they don't find anything. And then Peter jumps in the hole and he starts digging with his hands. And lo and behold, out comes the spear of Longinus, the lance that pierced Christ's side. And, you know, of course, we all know that it really wasn't. Peter knew it really wasn't. The leaders knew that it really wasn't, but they didn't care. The men thought that it was. And you wouldn't believe the inspiration they took from finding this thing. And then there were other things, comets that they could see overhead, believe it or not. This was a pretty important event. Anyway, they decided to just go out there and fight them on the plains. So they went out and they started to go out of the city to meet them on the plains and fight a pitched battle against them. Now, the Muslims, they knew that they could use archers to keep them in the city. They could easily reach the gates of the city and prevent them from coming out. But the Muslim leader, he said, no, let's let them get all out on the plain and then we'll crush them and get this over real quick, pronto. So the Muslims allowed them to go out onto the plain and get pitched out for a battle. And then they attacked. They attacked them from the front, as you can see here, the blue. And they attacked them from the back, as you can see here, the blue. And they got their asses kicked. The Christians won. The Christians crushed them. Because it's like I go back to saying, these guys were, as I said, they were murder machines. They were the most skilled, fierce fighters you can imagine. So here these guys are starving, literally starving, like, you know, Dachau starving. And yet there they were, and they kicked their asses and they won. And then when that happened, the inner citadel surrendered. Here, let me show you a video here.
Today is the anniversary of one of the most important sieges in the First Crusade. That is the Siege of Antioch, whose main battle took place on June 28th in 1098. Now, this battle took place after the Crusaders had already secured the outer city walls of the city of Antioch. The citadel, however, remained in the control of the Seljuk Turks, who occupied the city before the Crusaders came. Shortly after the Crusaders captured the outer city walls, a reinforcement army appeared to relieve the citadel. This army was unsuccessful, however, Instead, the Crusaders rode out and met the Seljuk Turks in the battlefield, catching them a little off guard. The Crusaders were starving and outnumbered, and nevertheless were able to defend the outer city walls. At this point, the citadel capitulated and surrendered to Bohemond, one of the leaders of the First Crusade.
Okay, they didn't catch him a little off guard. I think the wokey dokies are trying to make some excuses there. But at any rate, they won. They took Antioch, and then they went on down the coast, and eventually they did take Jerusalem. And when they did, they massacred the entire city, which everyone says is such a bad deal. But for the time, in the day and age, it wasn't unusual to do stuff like that. You know, when you get a bunch of guys who have been fighting, and they're starving, and they're undergoing great hardship, you know, when something like that happens, officers generally lose control, and they go crazy, and they do shit like that, which they did. But anyway, the First Crusade was a success. They took the Holy Land, they took Jerusalem, and they set up the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
When I was 16, I won a great victory. I felt in that moment I would live to be 100. Now I know I shall not see 30.
We must meet him before he reaches Kerak. I will lead the army.
My lord, if you travel, you die.
Assemble the army!
I can drop ties in this bitch, drop like flies in this bitch.
Now let's flash forward about 100 years, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem is pretty well ensconced there in the area. And the king is a kid named Baldwin IV. He became king when he was 13, and he was a leper. And in his later years, he wore a mask because his face was so disfigured. He died when he was 24. I have read differing accounts as to whether or not he was wearing a mask at the time of this battle. He was 16 at the time of the battle. He personally led his army into this battle. He had 400 knights, 350 to 400 mounted knights, and about 3,000 men on foot, and he took on a Muslim army of 20,000. And, you know, you'll get to see what happened here. Let me just go ahead and play the video.
Rose majestically, guarded by the Crusade Knights. A lone soldier bursts through the streets of holy shrines, drawing pilgrims and worshippers from far and wide. He bears grave tidings to the ruler of Jerusalem, King Baldwin IV, a 16-year-old youth stricken with leprosy. The Ayyubid dynasty assembles an enormous army and invades the territories of the Christian kingdom, headed straight for Jerusalem. An army led by the nightmare of crusaders, the King Saladin. There was a large crusader expedition from Europe in the kingdom at the time, led by Philip of Alsace, the Count of Flanders. But Philip was preoccupied with the city of Harim and Hama in northern Syria. There were only a few knights left in the kingdom. So Saladin seized the opportunity and brought his army from Egypt into the kingdom of Jerusalem in October, encountering very little resistance in the southern part of the kingdom. On top of this, Jerusalem's king, the young Baldwin IV, had leprosy. Although for the time being Baldwin's illness produced few physical signs, the lords and clergy of the kingdom knew that he was likely to die young. Learning of Saladin's plans, Baldwin left Jerusalem with, according to William of Tyre, only 375 knights to attempt a defense at Ascalon. When he reached Ascalon, Baldwin issued the Arar ban. This obligation for all able-bodied men to serve in the military was rarely enforced, and its use is an index of how desperate the situation appeared to be. Knowing that Crusader forces were reduced, Saladin moved at a relaxed pace up the coast into Palestine, ravaging and burning farmland and collecting booty. In the fortress of Gaza, Grand Master Odo of Saint-Amand gathers the Knights Templar within their stronghold and defends his position. However, Saladin opts to skirt around the Templar fortress and presses forward toward Ascalon. King Baldwin gathered the few troops available to him and led his forces out of the city to meet them. One knight is more eager to defeat Saladin, Reynald de Chatillon, Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, who had just been released from captivity in Aleppo in 1176. Reynald was a fierce enemy of Saladin and was King Baldwin's second in command. However, due to Baldwin's condition, the Frankish forces were physically led by Reynald. The Saladin army came into view, and Reynald realized how hopelessly outnumbered they were, and soon withdrew into the city again. Saladin considered that the royal army posed no threat, and determined to leave it in his rear, and to march straight on to Jerusalem. As Saladin's troops scattered to plunder the fertile coastal regions, they met parties of men hurrying on foot to join the king at Ascalon in obedience to the Amr ban. They were taken prisoner and strapped to camels in Saladin's baggage train to be sold as slaves. They raided Ramla, Lydda and Mirabel, among other places. Jerusalem had not been threatened for decades. Its walls were in disrepair state, and the terrified population sought refuge in the Tower of David. He also didn't leave anyone behind to guard Ascalon, either to prevent Baldwin from marching out again, or even just to report back to him if Baldwin left. Bernard Hamilton calls this an elementary lack of caution. Baldwin did indeed leave Ascalon and brought the army to Gaza, where they were joined by the Knights Templar. On November 25th, they tracked down the Sultan and his main army that had reached the hill of Montgisard, or Tel Jazar. Saladin's army was still widely dispersed and pillaging the surrounding land, and he could only recall the ones who were still within earshot. Consequently, he lost the advantage of overwhelmingly superior numbers, though he still had a larger force than the Franks, whose army consisted of 375 knights and a few thousand infantry. What the Saracens also failed to realize was they had been carefully maneuvered onto swampy ground, where superior numbers acted against them. The local knowledge of the ground is likely attributed to Lord Iblin. As Baldwin's army looked upon Saladin's, the king summoned the Bishop of Bethlehem to ride forward. The Crusaders had with them their most precious relic, the true cross believed to be wood, from the very cross of Jesus, carried by the bishop. The king, whose teenage body was already ravaged by aggressive leprosy, was helped from his horse and dropped to his knees before the cross. He prayed to God for victory and rose to his feet to cheers from his men, who were moved and deeply inspired by what they had just witnessed.
Jerusalem.
Forming for battle, Baldwin, Reynald's knights, and the Templars, even though numerically inferior, executed a full frontal heavy armoured cavalry charge at the centre of Saladin's hurriedly formed battle lines, immediately inflicting heavy casualties. The impact was immediate and devastating, creating a wedge breaking the enemy formation. Saladin's troops were spread out over a large area. He was trying to organize them into 3 or 4 blocks around the hill, and Reynald surprised him with a charge. A common tactic was to allow the Crusaders to charge, then maneuver the troops out of the way to almost let them pass through, but then surround and trap them. Saladin could have been planning to do that. Unfortunately for him, Reynald charged unexpectedly before Saladin had put all his remaining troops where he needed them. Saladin's army simply lost their formation, and the Crusader army chased them. One of Saladin's great nephews was killed, and Saladin himself was nearly killed, but he managed to escape, mounting a racing camel and rushing away to safety with only a few companions. Crusaders chased down the fleeing enemy, killed or captured as many of them as they could, and also captured a large amount of booty. The Muslim troops that had previously wandered off to plunder the land were also easily captured when they tried to return. The pursuit lasted into the night.
Anyway, they chased them all into the night. They killed them wherever they could. In the end, Saladin only got back with 10% of his army that he set out with. It's the kind of stuff you see in a movie, but it was real. Historians have long speculated about how history might have been different if old Baldwin hadn't been sick and died early. But anyway, his sister's husband took over after he died, and his sister's husband was an idiot. and he marched them armies out into Syria and got himself surrounded and massacred at Hattin, and that was pretty much the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And if you want to get an idea generally of what happened, just watch the movie Kingdom of Heaven. Although, like I'd said, there are lots of gaps in there that aren't historically accurate, but basically it does tell the story. So anyway, I hope you've learned something here, and I hope you've maybe been inspired to learn more about this, because this is a period of history that is often overlooked and shouldn't be.
The little girl described as a princess by her parents
was stabbed to death in a brutal attack.
Has been charged with 3 counts of murder and 10 of attempted murder.
The tragedy of the loss of one so young, all too evident.